My name is Vivienne Marsh. I am 38 years old. I want to start with the phone call. Not because the phone call is where the story begins. The story begins 17 years earlier. In the summer, I was 21, and my father was alive, and the specific shape of my family was still the shape I had grown up inside. But the phone call is where everything that had been building for 17 years arrived at the specific moment where I understood, with a clarity that I had not had before, exactly what I had built and why and what it had been worth building. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in October, 14 months ago, at 3:47 in the afternoon, while I was sitting at my desk in the office of Marsh Strategic Communications in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina, reviewing a client proposal that needed to be revised before the end of the week. I know the time precisely because I looked at my phone when it rang and saw the name and looked at the time and understood that the time and the name together constituted a specific convergence that I had not anticipated, but that I had, in some way I cannot fully explain, been waiting for. The name on the phone was Brandon Ellsworth. Brandon Ellsworth is my stepbrother. He is 34 years old. He is the only child of my stepmother, Cheryl Ellsworth Marsh, who married my father, Richard Marsh, in the spring of the year I turned 19, and who read my father's will aloud at Christmas dinner 4 years later and announced that my father had left me nothing, while she received the house and the investment accounts and the specific business he had spent 30 years building. I had not spoken to Brandon in 3 years. The last time I had spoken to him was at a family gathering that I attended because my half-sisters, my father's daughters with Cheryl, had asked me to come, and Brandon had made a specific comment about my business that I want to describe accurately, because it is directly relevant to why his phone call 3 years later was what it was. Brandon had said, at this family gathering, in the specific way he made comments about my work, which was the way of someone who needed to communicate that what I was doing was not serious. Vivienne's little consulting thing. You know how it is with these small shops. Sometimes they work out, sometimes they don't. He said this to a group of 4 people that included 2 of my clients, who were at the gathering because they were also family friends, which was the specific irony of a social world in Raleigh that overlaps in ways that Brandon did not always calculate correctly. I said nothing. One of my clients said, "Brandon, Vivienne's firm manages our statewide communications strategy." I wouldn't describe it as a little consulting thing. Brandon said, Of course. I just meant in the sense of," he did not finish the sentence. I said nothing. That was 3 years ago. Now his name was on my phone at 3:47 on a Thursday afternoon, and I looked at it for a moment and then I answered. He said, "Vivienne." I said, "Brandon." He said, "I need to talk to you about something." I said, "All right." He said, "It's about Ellsworth Marketing. I have a situation, and I think you might be the only person who can help me." I sat back in my chair and I looked at the client proposal on my desk, and I thought about 17 years and a Christmas dinner and a comment at a family gathering, and the specific 3 words he had used. The only person who can help me. And I understood what they meant and what they meant about the 17 years preceding them. I said, "Tell me what's happening. Before I tell you what he said and what I decided and what happened in the months that followed, let me take you back to the beginning. Because the beginning is where I first understood what kind of family I was in after my father married Cheryl, and what the specific decision I made in the years after the Christmas dinner cost me and built for me, and what 17 years of building something looks like when you are building it from a starting point of nothing. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, the only child of Richard and Patricia Marsh, who had married in 1983, and who had built their life in the specific way of a family organized around my father's business, Marsh Communications, a regional public relations and communications firm that my father had founded in 1986 with 1 client and a spare bedroom in our house on Glenwood Avenue that served as his office for 3 years before the business was large enough to justify actual office space. My mother died when I was 12. I want to say this plainly and without extended description, because her death is not the center of this story, but it is the specific fact that explains everything else, the fact that without it, the story that follows does not happen. She died of an aggressive cancer in the fall of the year I turned 12, in the specific fast trajectory of a disease that gives you 8 months from diagnosis to the end and does not waste time on ambiguity. My father raised me alone from that point. He did it well, in the specific, genuine way of a father who had not been the primary caretaker before his wife's death, and who became the primary caretaker after it with the full commitment of someone who understood that this was the most important work he had ever been given to do. He was not perfect at it. He made the specific mistakes that fathers who are also running demanding businesses make when they are also the sole parent. Mistakes of availability and of the particular kind of emotional attunement that requires a quality of presence that very busy people with demanding professional lives sometimes cannot sustain consistently. But he was there, and he was trying, and he loved me in the specific, genuine way that some fathers love their daughters, which is completely and with the particular quality of someone who sees you clearly. Marsh Communications grew. I watched it grow from the spare bedroom on Glenwood Avenue through the first office and the hiring of the first employees and the expansion of the client list and the specific accumulation of the reputation that a well-run regional communications firm builds across 15 years of doing good work for clients who tell other clients. By the time I was in high school, the firm had 38 employees and a client list that included some of the most significant organizations in North Carolina. And my father had the particular professional standing of someone who had built something real from nothing and who was known in his field for exactly the quality of work that produces that standing. I was part of this in ways that were informal and entirely natural. I came to the office after school. I helped file things and answer phones in the summer. I absorbed, across the years of growing up alongside a functioning business, a specific understanding of what a communications firm did and why and how. The particular ambient knowledge that children of business owners accumulate when the business is part of their household's daily fabric. My father met Cheryl at a charity gala in the fall of the year I turned 17. She was a widow with a 12-year-old son, Brandon, and she was attractive and organized, and she brought to my father's life the specific things that a man who had been the sole parent of a teenage daughter for 5 years needed, which was adult company and the particular warmth of someone who was interested in him as a person rather than as a professional. I liked her, initially. I want to say this because it is true, and because the story that follows would be easier to understand if I had disliked her from the beginning, and did not. She was warm to me in the early months in the specific, genuine way of a woman who understood that my father's daughter was the most important relationship in the household and who made real efforts to be present with me in the ways that mattered. Brandon was different. Brandon was 12 when we met, and I was 17, and we had the specific relationship of two adolescents who have been required to share a family by their parents' choices, and who have nothing in common except the requirement, which produced a relationship that was neutral in the way of necessary coexistence rather than genuine connection. What changed across the 2 years of my father's relationship with Cheryl and the subsequent marriage? The change that I noticed and that my father did not notice because it was gradual and because he was in love, and because people who are in love sometimes do not see what people who are not in love can see clearly from the outside, was the specific shift in Cheryl's orientation toward the household and toward my father's business. The shift was not dramatic. It was the specific accumulated drift of someone who had come into a household as a guest, and who was gradually, through the particular patient process of establishing herself as essential, becoming the person who understood the household's management better than anyone else, and who made herself the necessary mediating layer between my father and almost everything he needed to be connected to. She managed his calendar. She managed the social engagements. She developed specific opinions about the business that she communicated through the particular indirect channel of pillow talk and dinner conversation, and the accumulated influence of daily proximity. She built a specific relationship with certain of my father's business partners that was organized around her rather than around the partnership, so that the partnerships became, over time, Relationships that ran partly through Cheryl. I watched this. I was 17 and then 18 and then 19, and I watched it with the particular attention of someone who had been the sole person in her father's household for 5 years, and who understood the household's specific patterns well enough to notice when the patterns were being changed and by whom. I said something to my father once. I want to be honest about the fact that I said it because the story should include the moment when I tried. I said, "Dad, I think Cheryl is positioning herself in the business in ways that might not be good for the business." He said, "Vivienne, she's being helpful." I said, "I know she is being helpful. I'm saying the help has a specific direction to it." He said, "She's my wife." I said, "I know." He said, "I trust her." I said, "I know you do." He said, "That's the end of the conversation." I went to college that fall, at UNC Chapel Hill, where I studied communications because I had grown up in a communications firm, and because the specific aptitude for understanding how language and strategy and audience interact was something I had been developing since I was old enough to observe my father work. I was gone for 4 years, and in those 4 years, the specific things I had been watching happen accelerated in the way that things accelerate when the person who was watching them happens not to be watching. My father had a heart attack in my junior year. He recovered. But the recovery was the specific recovery of a man who understands, at 61, that his body has told him something important about the pace of his life. And the understanding produced a series of decisions that I believe Cheryl had been patiently positioning herself for, which was the formal incorporation of her into the business and the specific restructuring of the firm's ownership in ways that reflected her position as wife and partner. I graduated and came back to Raleigh. The firm was different from what it had been when I left. Not in its work, which was still good. In its specific organizational structure, which now included Cheryl as the chief operating officer and Brandon, who had graduated from a local college and who had been installed, while I was finishing my senior year, as the firm's business development director, despite the specific absence of any professional background in business development. My father offered me a position at the firm. I said yes, because the firm was my father's, and I had grown up in it, and because the work was the work I had studied, and because saying no felt like abandoning something I loved. I spent 2 years at Marsh Communications. I worked hard and I did good work, and I built the specific client relationships that my aptitude for the work produced, and I also observed, with the specific professional clarity I had now in addition to the childhood clarity I had always had, that the organizational structure in which I was working was one in which every path toward meaningful advancement ran through Cheryl or through Brandon, who was now a year into a business development role that he was performing with mediocre results, but that he had the title for and the specific proximity to Cheryl that the title did not require to be earned. My father died at the end of those 2 years. He was 65. Another cardiac event, the second one, which was the specific kind that does not permit recovery. He died on a Tuesday morning in November, quickly, without the extended decline that allows time for conversations that need to happen. I did not know what his will said. I want to be precise about this because I think it matters to the story. I had not seen the will and I had not discussed it with my father in any direct way. I had assumed, with the specific unexamined assumption of someone who grew up as an only child in a household organized around a father who loved her, that the will would reflect some version of the life we had built together and the business I had grown up inside. The Christmas dinner was 6 weeks after his death. I want to describe the Christmas dinner specifically because the specificity is what makes it what it was. Cheryl organized Christmas dinner at the house on Glenwood Avenue, the house where I had grown up, and that was now, along with everything else, in the process of being clarified as belonging to whose estate and under whose control. It was a family gathering, the specific kind of gathering that happens after a death when the family is still assembling around the absence and when the administrative reality of what the absence means has not yet been fully confronted. My half-sisters were there. Emma, who was 15, and Sophia, who was 13. My father's daughters with Cheryl, who were now without their father, and who deserved better from the adults in the room than what the adults in the room were about to provide. Brandon was there. Cheryl's parents were there. I was there because my half-sisters had asked me to come, and because the house was the house I had grown up in, and the Christmas table was the specific table around which my actual family had gathered for the 12 Christmases before my mother died and the 6 after. After dinner, while we were still at the table, Cheryl said she had something she needed to share with everyone. She produced a document, a copy of my father's will. She read it aloud. I want to tell you what the will said, specifically because I think the specificity serves the story more than a general account. The will left the house to Cheryl. The will left the investment accounts, approximately $800,000 in aggregate, to Cheryl. The will left Marsh Communications to Cheryl and Brandon in equal shares, with Cheryl holding majority operational control. There were specific bequests for Emma and Sophia establishing educational trusts. There was a bequest for me of $25,000, which was characterized in the will's language as a specific gift in recognition of our relationship. $25,000. The house, the accounts, the business worth several $1,000,000 in enterprise value, to Cheryl and Brandon. $25,000 to me. Cheryl read this aloud at the Christmas dinner table, with my half-sisters present, and Cheryl's parents present, and Brandon present. And when she finished reading, she looked at me across the table with the specific quality of someone who had been waiting to deliver this information in this setting for a specific reason that I understood in the moment she delivered it. The reason was the audience. The reason was that delivering the information at a family dinner, publicly, with witnesses, in the house where I had grown up, was the specific mechanism by which the information was most conclusively communicated and most difficult to respond to. I said nothing. This was not a decision I made with conscious deliberation. It was the specific response of someone who is absorbing something larger than the immediate moment can process, and who understands that the response the situation deserves is not available in the moment the situation presents itself. Brandon said, "It's been really hard on all of us. Dad built something really important, and we're going to honor what he built. He called my father Dad." I looked at Brandon. I looked at my half-sisters, who were 15 and 13, and who were looking at me with the specific expression of teenagers who understand something significant is happening, and who do not have the framework to know what to do with that understanding. I said, "Excuse me." I got up from the table and went to the bathroom in the hallway, and stood there for approximately 8 minutes, and then I came back to the table, and I said goodbye to my half-sisters, and I said nothing to Cheryl, and I said nothing to Brandon, and I left the house on Glenwood Avenue. I drove home to my apartment. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I thought about my father and about the specific quality of his love for me, which had been real, and about the will and what it said and what it meant about what had happened in the years after my father's heart attack, when Cheryl had the specific access to him and his decisions that proximity and marriage produce. I thought about my 2 years at the firm and the specific organizational reality I had observed. I thought about $25,000. I thought about what I was going to do. What I decided that night, sitting at the kitchen table in my apartment with the specific clarity that sometimes comes after the specific shock of something that costs everything, was not about the will. Contesting the will was something I looked into in the weeks after Christmas, with a specific attorney in Raleigh who reviewed the documents and who told me that the will appeared to have been properly executed, and that a challenge would be expensive and the outcome was uncertain, and that I should make my decision about whether to pursue it based on what I wanted to accomplish, rather than on what I was owed. I decided not to contest it, not because I believed the will reflected my father's true wishes, not because I was not angry, because contesting it would cost me years and money and the specific energy I needed for something else, and because I understood that the something else was what actually mattered. I was 25 years old. I had grown up in a communications firm, I had studied communications. I had 2 years of professional experience. I had $25,000. I was going to build a firm. I want to tell you about the 12 years between the Christmas dinner and Brandon's phone call, because those 12 years are the specific substance of this story, and they deserve to be described with the honest detail that building something from nothing across 12 years actually requires. I started Marsh Strategic Communications in the January following the Christmas dinner, 6 weeks after it. I used the $25,000 as initial capital, the specific amount that was mine legally, and that I was going to deploy toward the specific thing I was going to build. The early months were the particular experience of beginning that is simultaneously completely practical and completely terrifying. I had one client, a nonprofit that I had developed a relationship with during my time at my father's firm, and who had called me after I left to ask if I was planning to continue working with them independently. That one client became the specific foundation on which everything else was built, because they paid their invoices on time, and they referred me to 2 additional clients in the first year, and those 2 clients referred me to 3 more, and the specific compound growth of a reputation built on good work in a professional community where people know each other produced, across the first 3 years, a client list of 11 organizations and a team of 4 people including me. I want to tell you about the work specifically because I think the specific quality of the work is relevant to understanding what the firm eventually became. Marsh Communications, my father's firm, was a traditional public relations firm in the specific mode of regional PR practices of its era, organized around media relations and press releases, and the particular mechanisms of earned media that dominated communications practice before the specific disruption of digital channels and social media fundamentally reorganized how organizations communicated with their audiences. The firm had adapted to these changes partially but not completely, the specific challenge of established practices encountering new environments. What I built was different. Not different in the sense of rejecting what I had grown up with, but different in the sense of taking the specific core of what communications practice was, which was helping organizations communicate clearly and effectively with the specific audiences they needed to reach, and applying it to the new environment rather than trying to adapt the old tools to a context they were not built for. I developed a practice organized around what I came to call strategic narrative, the specific work of helping organizations understand what they were actually trying to say, and to whom, and through what channels and why, before worrying about the specific tactics of how to say it. This sounds obvious. It is not the way most communications firms of any era organize their work, which tends to be organized around the tactics rather than around the strategy that should determine which tactics are appropriate. The strategic narrative practice was distinctive enough that it produced, across the first 5 years of the firm, a specific reputation in the Raleigh-Durham-Chapel Hill professional community as the firm you went to when you had a complicated communications problem that needed thinking before it needed executing. This reputation is the specific reputation that produces the most valuable kind of client relationship, which is the relationship with clients who trust your judgment and who remain clients across years because the judgment they trusted has been consistently proven trustworthy. By the 7th year, Marsh Strategic Communications had 31 employees, a client list that included organizations across North Carolina and into neighboring states, and an annual revenue that I will not specify precisely, but that was substantial in the specific sense that distinguished a genuinely successful professional services firm from a marginally viable small business. I tracked Marsh Communications across those years. Not obsessively, not as a primary focus of my attention, but with the specific professional awareness of someone whose business operates in the same market as another business, and who understands the competitive landscape well enough to know what is happening in it. What was happening at Marsh Communications was the specific thing that happens to professional services firms, when the people running them are more focused on the extraction of value from the existing business than on the investment of energy required to sustain its competitive position. The client list contracted. Several of the senior employees who had been there since my father's time left because they were the specific kind of experienced professionals who understand when a firm's trajectory is declining and who have the options to act on that understanding. The firm's reputation, which had been built on 30 years of consistently good work, began to experience the particular erosion that happens when the work becomes inconsistent. Brandon, who had the title of president at Marsh Communications by the 4th year after my father's death, had made several specific business development decisions that I knew about from the market, because they had produced specific market consequences. He had pursued and won a large state government communications contract that was outside the firm's core competence, managed it badly, lost it, and in the process, damaged the firm's relationship with several state agencies that had been long-standing clients. He had attempted to diversify into digital marketing services without building the specific expertise that digital marketing requires, with predictable results. The firm was not in crisis when Brandon called me, but it was in the specific earlier stage of difficulty that precedes crisis, the stage where the people running the firm should be making specific strategic decisions that they are not making because they do not have the expertise to understand what the decisions are or what they would require. Brandon had come to understand that he was in that stage. He had also come to understand that I was the specific person in the market with the expertise he needed. Let me stop here for a moment because I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever been in the situation of being the only person who could help someone who had cost you everything, and of having to decide what to do with that specific position, not from anger or from a desire for vindication, but from the actual question of what the right thing to do was? Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Because what I decided when Brandon called me on that Thursday afternoon is the most important decision of this story, and I want you to understand the full context before I tell you what I decided. If you have not subscribed yet, please do. Brandon said, "We have a strategic problem. The firm has lost direction and the client relationships are deteriorating, and I've tried several things that haven't worked, and I think the problem is more fundamental than I've been treating it." I said, "Tell me specifically." He said, "We've lost 4 major clients in the past 18 months. The state contracts, the Meridian account, 2 others. The team is demoralized. I've hired 2 different CMOs who haven't fixed it." I said, "What do you think the problem is?" He said, "I think the firm doesn't know what it's for anymore, what it's supposed to be good at." I said, "That's accurate." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You know the firm. You grew up in it." I said, "Yes." He said, "I need someone who understands what it was and what it could be and who has the expertise to get it there." I said, "That's a specific description of a strategy engagement." He said, "I know what I'm asking. I know what it means that I'm asking you." I said, "Do you?" He said, "Yes. I know what happened at Christmas. I know what Mama did. I know you've built something, and I know you didn't have anything when you started." He said, "I know all of that." I said, "What are you asking for specifically?" He said, "A strategy engagement, firm assessment, competitive analysis, strategic repositioning. Whatever it takes to understand what Marsh Communications should be and how to get there." I said, "And Cheryl?" He said, "Mama is not involved in the day-to-day. She has equity, but she stepped back from operations 3 years ago." I said, "Does she know you're calling me?" He said, "No." I said, "Would she object?" He was quiet. He said, "Probably." I said, "Why are you calling me anyway?" He said, "Because you're the best at what you do in this market, and I need the best, and I've run out of other options." I sat with this for a long time. The client proposal was still on my desk. The afternoon light was at the specific angle of North Carolina in October, coming through the windows of the office I had built from $25,000 across 12 years. I said, "Brandon, I need to ask you something honestly." He said, "All right." I said, "When you called my firm a little consulting thing at the Carmichael event 3 years ago, in front of 2 of my clients, what were you thinking?" He was quiet. He said, "I wasn't thinking carefully enough." I said, "That's true." "Were you thinking at all?" He said, "I was doing what I did in those years, which was not thinking carefully about things that should have required careful thought." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because it was easier not to." I said, "That's also accurate." He said, "Vivienne, I know I don't have any standing to ask you for this. I know what it looks like." I said, "Tell me what you think it looks like." He said, "It looks like a man who benefited from decisions that cost you everything, calling you 12 years later to help him fix what those decisions broke." I said, "That is exactly what it looks like." He said, "And I'm asking anyway." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because there are 47 people at Marsh Communications who didn't make any of the decisions that put the firm where it is and who are going to lose their jobs if the firm goes under." I sat with that. He said, "And because the firm was your father's, he built it. Whatever happened after he died, whatever Mama did, the firm was his, and it carries his name, and I think on some level you understand what it would mean for it to close." I said nothing for a long time. He said, "I'm sorry. For the Christmas dinner. For the little consulting thing comment. For not being the kind of person who understood what he had been given and what it cost someone else." He said, "I'm not saying that to get you to take the engagement. I'm saying it because it's true and I should have said it a long time ago." I looked at the proposal on my desk. I thought about 47 people who had not made the decisions that put their employer in the position it was in. I thought about my father's name on a building in Raleigh that I drove past sometimes on my way to client meetings. I said, "I'm going to tell you something about why I'm going to take this engagement." He said, "All right." I said, "I'm not taking it for you. I'm not taking it for Cheryl, who I don't believe would want me to and who I am not going to discuss with you in the context of this engagement. I'm taking it because your father and my father are the same man, and the firm he built deserves the specific chance that good strategic advice can provide, and because you were right that I understand what it would mean for it to close." I said, "I'm also taking it because what I do is help organizations understand what they're for and how to get there, and Marsh Communications is an organization in this market that has the specific problem I know how to solve, and the fact that the history between us is what it is does not make the work less valuable or less worth doing." He said, "That's more generous than I deserve." I said, "Yes." I said, "My standard engagement terms. I'll send you the proposal by end of week." I want to tell you what I found when I conducted the assessment, because the finding is the specific part of this story that closes the loop I have been describing. I spent 6 weeks in comprehensive assessment of Marsh Communications. Client interviews, staff interviews, financial review, competitive analysis, market positioning analysis. The specific structured diagnostic work of understanding what an organization was, what it had been, what it could be, and what the gap was between where it was and where it could be. What I found was this. The firm had been built on a specific reputation for quality that was genuinely earned across 30 years of my father's leadership. That reputation had not entirely dissipated. Several of the firm's longest-standing clients had remained through the difficult years, specifically because the relationships they had were with the firm's senior staff, people who had been there since my father's time and who embodied the quality that the firm's reputation was built on. Those staff members were, in every case, aware that the firm's current direction was not sustainable. In every case, they had tried to communicate this to Brandon through the specific channels available to them. In several cases, they had been dismissed or minimized in ways that were not useful to anyone. The competitive landscape had also shifted in ways that created a specific opportunity for a firm with Marsh Communications' existing relationships and existing staff if those resources were deployed in a different strategic direction than the one Brandon had been pursuing. The market for the kind of strategic narrative work that I had built my firm around was expanding, and Marsh Communications had the specific existing relationships and existing expertise that could be redirected toward that market if the strategic repositioning was executed well. I wrote a 47-page strategic assessment and repositioning plan. It was the most thorough document I had produced for any client in 12 years. Not because Marsh Communications required more than any other client, but because I understood the firm with the specific depth of someone who had grown up in it and who had been thinking about it from the outside for 12 years. I presented the assessment to Brandon and the firm's senior leadership team. The presentation took 3 hours. When I finished, the director of client services, a woman named Patricia, who had been at the firm since before my father died, and who had known me since I was 12 years old, said, "This is what your father would have done." She was not talking about the specific strategic recommendations. She was talking about the specific quality of the thinking, the particular approach of looking at an organization clearly and understanding what it was for and what it needed to do to fulfill that purpose. I said, "I know." Brandon said, "How long do you think it takes to turn this around if we execute the plan?" I said, 18 months minimum to see significant results. 36 months to be stable. You need to commit to the process for the full period. He said, "I'm committed." He said, "Vivienne, I want to ask you something." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "Would you consider staying on as a strategic advisor through the implementation? Not as an employee, as an ongoing engagement?" I said, "That depends on whether the implementation is done with the specific seriousness the plan requires." He said, "I'll do whatever the plan requires." I looked at him. He said, "I mean it." I said, "I know you do. That's why I'm considering it. I want to tell you what happened with Cheryl, because she is in this story, and the story requires honesty about her role in the part of it that I was not present for. Cheryl found out about the engagement in the 2nd month. Not from me. From a mutual contact who mentioned to her that Marsh Strategic Communications had been retained by Marsh Communications for a strategy engagement, in the specific casual way that information circulates in professional communities where people know each other. She called Brandon. Brandon told me about the call the following day. He said she had said several things, some of which he was not going to repeat to me, and some of which he was. He said, "She asked me why I hadn't told her." He said, "I told her I hadn't told her because I knew she would try to prevent it, and I had made a decision that the firm needed what you could provide, and I wasn't going to allow her feelings about you to prevent me from getting what the firm needed." I said, "How did she respond to that?" He said, "She was very quiet. She said that she understood why I made the decision." He said, "And then she said something I want to tell you." I said, "Tell me." He said, "She said she had done things that she would not have done if she had understood earlier what she was doing. She didn't specify. She said she had made decisions in the years after Richard died that she had told herself were for the family, and that she understood now were not." He said, "She said if you were willing to help the firm, that meant you were a bigger person than she had given you credit for." I said, "She said that." He said, "Yes." I said, "Is that an apology?" He said, "I think it's the closest she knows how to come to one." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "It's enough." He said, "Is it?" I said, "It's not what I would have chosen, but it's what is available and it's real, and I'm going to receive it as what it is, rather than as what I might prefer it to be." He said, "You're a more specific person than I knew." I said, "I know. The implementation has been ongoing for 14 months now. The firm is in the specific stage of strategic repositioning where the early signs are positive, and the full results require more time to confirm, which is exactly what the plan described." 2 of the clients who left have returned. The senior staff who have been there since my father's time are more engaged than they have been in years. I want to tell you something about working with Marsh Communications that I did not anticipate before the engagement began. I anticipated it being difficult emotionally. I anticipated the specific texture of being in the firm my father built, and that I had not been part of for 15 years. The particular complexity of working alongside people who had known me as a child and who had also been present for the Christmas dinner and who knew the full history of what had happened. What I did not anticipate was what it felt like to be inside my father's firm and to be doing the specific work of understanding what it was for and helping it become that again. My father built Marsh Communications as a firm that helped organizations say true things clearly and effectively to the people who needed to hear them. That was, in his 30 years of running it, the consistent organizing principle of what the firm did and why. That is also what I built Marsh Strategic Communications to do. I thought about this one afternoon in the Marsh Communications conference room, the same conference room I had sat in as a 12-year-old doing homework while my father finished meetings, surrounded by the specific evidence of a firm in the process of reorienting itself toward something it had lost the thread of. I thought about my father and about what he built and about what I had built from nothing 12 years ago with $25,000, and about how the two things separated by 15 years and a Christmas dinner and everything that had happened between were organized around the same specific principle. He would have found this specific. I think he would have been pleased. Here is what 12 years of building from nothing and one engagement with the firm my father built taught me. I know that building something is the specific answer to being told you have nothing, not because the building is revenge and not because it is proof of anything to anyone other than yourself, but because the building is the productive use of the specific situation you are in, and the situation you are in after you have lost everything that was given to you is the situation of someone who has only what they can build themselves, which turns out to be more than enough. I know that when the person who cost you everything eventually needs the specific thing you built, the decision of what to do is not about what they deserve. It is about what the situation requires and what you are capable of providing, and what the doing of it means for the people whose lives are affected by it. And those questions have answers that are independent of what the person deserves. I know that the strategic narrative work I built my firm around, the work of helping organizations understand what they are for and how to say it clearly to the people who need to hear it, is the specific work my father spent 30 years doing under a different name, and that I learned it from growing up in his firm before I understood that I was learning anything, and that the $25,000 he left me was the specific amount of capital that allowed me to build what he had taught me how to build without knowing he was teaching me. I know that the Christmas dinner was the specific beginning of everything I am and everything I have built, not because it was a gift, but because the specific loss it produced was the specific loss that my specific capabilities were exactly suited to recover from and transform into something. And I know that the phone call at 3:47 on a Thursday afternoon was not the end of the story. It was the moment when the story that had been building for 12 years became fully visible. And becoming visible is not the same as being complete. The firm is still in implementation. I am still the strategic advisor. I drive past the Marsh Communications office on Providence Road sometimes on my way to client meetings, and the name on the building is my father's name, which is also my name. And the firm inside it is doing the specific work my father built it to do, which is the work I have spent 12 years doing from a different address. That is what I have built. That is what the $25,000 became. That is my story. A Christmas dinner and a will read aloud at a table. $25,000. 12 years of building something specific from nothing. And a phone call on a Thursday afternoon from the only person in the world who could have made that specific call, asking for the only thing I had spent 12 years becoming capable of giving. If this reminded you of something you built from nothing after someone took everything, I want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to know that the specific thing you are capable of building from where you are is exactly what the situation requires, even if the situation is not what you would have chosen. Hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.